Good afternoon. Chuck Morse here, the Morse Force. I'm joined by Alex Newman. He's an author, journalist, activist. He's presently delivering speeches in Washington State and in the northwestern part of the United States on behalf of various groups, also generally supporting Republicans in the upcoming midterm election, which is only 4 weeks away from today. Alex, thanks for joining me.
Chuck, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Alex, you're talking quite a bit about, and many of your articles have addressed the deep state, what President Trump accurately calls the deep state. And I'd like you to just talk a bit about how you define the deep state and what role they are presently playing in this critical upcoming election.
Sure. Well, thank you, Chuck. And, I think this is one of the most important issues that the American people need to be focused on. And now is a historic opportunity to talk about it because we have a president in the White House who's lashing out against what he describes as the criminal deep state. And so, I've been working on exposing these people almost my entire career. And it's very nice to have somebody in the White House who's saying some of the same things. So the deep state, as I define it, I actually did a whole special issue of the New American. Of the New American magazine. Now we've published that as an ebook online so people can get a lot more detail there. And I've been going around, just the last few days, I've been traveling the northern United States, Montana, Idaho, Washington, Wisconsin, talking about the deep state to, Republican groups and conservative groups and JBS groups, just all over the place. And my main point is I kind of divide it up into 5 subsections to kind of make it more manageable. So we have the bureaucracy, right? And I think at this point, everybody, even the liberals, recognizes that we have what's called a deep state within the bureaucracy, this kind of cabal of unelected people who tries to, turn things their direction regardless of what we vote for, right? They write the regulations, they set up the system to benefit themselves and to move their agenda forward. We know from the data that of the money they gave in the 2016 campaign, as just one example, something like 97% of it went to Hillary Clinton. In some of the departments, the Department of Education, it was like 99.7% of the money they donated went to Hillary Clinton. So maybe one guy in the Department of Education threw a few bucks to Donald Trump, and that's the situation. These are the people who educate the kids. So that's well known enough. Then we have the intelligence community, so-called. And I always start with the caveat that there's a lot of good people working in the CIA and the NSA. I have good friends who work there or have worked there, and they love America, they love God, they love the Constitution. They're good people. But at the top, we have people like John Brennan, right, who was on our television recently calling our president a traitor. This is a guy who admitted before he realized Trump was going to be president that he had voted for the Communist Party USA candidate in 1976 election, Gus Hall, who was literally an agent of the mass murdering regime in the Soviet Union, murdered tens of millions of people more. So, when he went to apply for a security clearance, he told them, I voted for the Communist Party, the Soviet agent, and, they fired him, right? No, of course not. They gave him a security clearance and they moved him up the ranks so quick that he became Obama's CIA director. And then we get to what I call the deep state behind the deep state, which is this is, I think, where Americans really need to be focusing, because this is what people don't, by and large, 75% of Americans now are concerned about the deep state, and they know about some of this, but they don't know what I call the deep state behind the deep state, at least not enough. And so that's what I'm really focusing on. And then I bring in, the Council on Foreign Relations, this group that Hillary Clinton said tells her what she should be doing and how she should be thinking about the future. That's what she said while she was Secretary of State. Dick Cheney, Vice President Bush's vice president, said, I've been a member and a director for a long time, and I never told the folks back in Wyoming when I was running for re-election. So, they're all part of this little club, and their agenda is very, very clear. World government. They say it openly in their magazines. Their leading figures brag about, we're eroding sovereignty, moving toward global governance. So they're very clear about that. You have the Trilateral Commission, another one of these groups, the Bilderberg meetings. I've been to 2 of them, once as an uninvited guest and once as a journalist. On the outside, I got a chance to speak to some of them. And then there's, the real shadowy stuff, the secret societies. You think of, Skull and Bones, where you had John Kerry and George W. Bush both running in the election, both members of the same secret society. And you have a Bohemian Grove, where 2,500 of the most powerful men in the world get together out in the woods of California and do Well, Alex Jones snuck in there with a video camera and recorded. You can go watch it on YouTube. They got a big owl and they're wearing hoods and chanting about forest spirits and who knows what else. It's weird stuff. I don't care if you're a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim. Somebody ought to explain to us what these people are doing in front of a 40-foot owl with fires. And it's weird. So that's what I call the deep state. And that's what I've been talking about. And then most recently, Chuck, we just put out a special issue called The Deep State in Action, where I worked with my friend of the New American, where I worked with Bill Jasper, the senior editor, and some other really good patriots and investigative journalists, exposing how they work. And you and I have talked a little bit about that. The mass immigration, for example, is a key strategy in the erasing of national boundaries and the erasing of nations as we know them. And all different things, the UN environmental agenda. So that's kind of what I'm working on here on these speeches and what I'm doing at the New American.
So the deep state basically is an apparatus that goes back, well, it goes back hundreds of years, but it's, I think it really took hold in this country probably during the administration of Wilson or even possibly Teddy Roosevelt. And it's an informal, indirect government. There's actually a professor at Tufts University, Michael Glennon, who just wrote a book called The Double Government. And he's an establishment guy. He was a chief counsel to the U.S. Senate in the Clinton administration. And he says that it all started with the establishment of the national security apparatus in 1948 and how they've become so powerful and they've got their tentacles in so many different agencies. But the point is that there are many theories about this, all of which have a lot of truth to them. We have informal government, unelected officials on a lot of levels who are making laws, and not just Supreme Court judges either, but these bureaucracies which create laws that they give other names, guidelines, other things like that. We find out suddenly that you can't have a puddle in your backyard without it being declared illegal because they changed the language of the Clean Water Act, which really was only, large bodyways, like the Mississippi River, to any body of water. And they did so under the color of the law. So you have informal government, which is not representing the people of the country in the form of a Congress or a state legislature making laws. And they are being threatened by the presidency of Donald Trump, who clearly was not supposed to win and who is clearly facing what I would describe, what many have described as a virtual coup d'etat. In terms of taking him out of office. But that brings me to a question as well, which is that even though I do think that Donald Trump is fully conscious of this, I've heard, for example, that his father was a quiet member of the John Birch Society, which tells me that he knows what's going on. However, there probably are a couple of deep staters in his administration close to him. Who are they?
Yeah, it's a great point, Chuck. There are, and we know some of them. And Trump was exposed to a lot of this material growing up. Roger Stone told me the same thing about, Donald Trump's father being a good friend of Robert Welch, funder of the John Birch Society. And, I know Birchers who worked at high levels in his campaign who know him. And they tell me, Alex, he knows all this stuff. But there are clearly some deep state people in his administration. I think the easiest way to sort out who's who is to look who in his administration in the upper levels is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, of the Trilateral Commission, who regularly goes to Bilderberg meetings, who's involved in these secret societies. And, when we start looking at that, we come up with a few very, very clear people who are involved with this. Elaine Chao, who's Secretary of Transportation, member of many of these organizations. And, there's a logical explanation for why she's there. I've heard it explained, she's married to Mitch McConnell, and Mitch McConnell's the guy who's got to approve, through the Senate, all of his appointees. And so, he had to throw him a bone and hopefully get some good people. And he does have good people in there, too. He's got some very good people in his administration who, are very like-minded and who understand this. In fact, Rich Higgins, the director of policy and planning at the National Security Council, before he was removed by a deep stater, H.R. McMaster, outlined some of these exact same things, Chuck. He talked about the deep state, how the Islamists and the globalists and the socialists were uniting into one to wage war on Trump, to wage war on the American people, on the American ideal. He described what they were doing as sort of like a Maoist insurgency, and he actually used the term the deep state to describe what we're dealing with. So a lot of good people. As I mentioned, he was fired by H.R. McMaster, who was total deep state establishment guy. We've got people like trade representative, the U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, member of the Council on Foreign Relations, who just dropped this monstrosity on us called the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement. I mean, Trump is saying all the right things, but then he's got his CFR members in his administration working on disastrous things like this trade agreement, which is going to surrender more of our sovereignty, even though Trump has clearly said that it is now our policy to reject globalism, to embrace national sovereignty and national independence, and to quit with the multilateral trade deals. He said this over and over and over again, and yet CFR people high in his administration are still pushing this stuff. So those are a few examples. There are some others. The really good news is that there's significantly less of these people than there have been in previous administrations. If you look at the Bush administration, the Obama, the Clinton, it doesn't matter. They have been absolutely packed with these people.
I mean, they were just outright tools of this establishment.
That's right.
I mean, the classic example, of course, is the Clintons, who knew that they could practically operate as a law in and of themselves and enrich themselves and become super powerful, and know they would never be held accountable as long as they genuflected in the direction of this establishment. That's I think, something they probably realized when they got started. As far as the new trade agreement goes, I haven't actually read it, but it seems to me to be at least somewhat of an improvement over NAFTA. But yeah, it probably still has elements of it that erode national sovereignty.
Yeah, well, it's I have not read it myself either. It's 1,800 pages. I'm quite sure Trump has not read it either, because if he had, I think he would very quickly realize what was going on here. But my colleague at the New American, Christian Gomez, has been doing a lot of reading and a lot of searching through this, and there are some very dangerous provisions. And if you really want to know what the globalists think about this agreement, you have Richard Haas, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations. He sent out a message saying that this agreement was TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump very wisely withdrew us from, plus NAFTA, plus 10 or 20%, and we got to get it passed right away. So right now it looks like it's running into some opposition in Congress. I think that's good. We've had top Republican people say that this is probably not going. It's definitely not going to happen before the midterms. It's probably not going to happen in the lame duck session. And so I hope we have some time. I think, but I think somebody needs to get this information to Trump, and we're working to do that right now so that he realizes that what's in this is just absolutely dangerous. It flies in the face of what he said, and yet there's a few provisions in there that conservatives could embrace. We don't want China setting, as Trump explained, we don't want China setting up front companies in Canada and Mexico and shipping in a bunch of junk with no tariffs while they extort us every time we try to send something over there and steal all our technology. So those are all good things, but all those can be accomplished without giving up our sovereignty to transnational bureaucracies, without setting up international kangaroo courts that are going to have the purported authority to overrule our state and federal officials. And I think Trump recognizes this too. So I think we need to get this information to him and to the American people and to Republicans in Congress so that this thing can be derailed and we can get back to what we need to be doing, which is dismantle globalism. But on this topic of the CFR, they just came out a couple of days ago, Chuck, with an article calling for the creation of a committee to save the world order from Trump. They said. Yeah, they wanted the nine closest allies of the United States to form a military alliance to hold down the fort on the New World Order until they can get rid of Trump and bring in, a more pliable president. So these people are very concerned about Trump, and that, from my perspective, is a great thing. That means he's doing something right, and he's got these people scared. Wow, I mean that's incredible. It kind of reminds me of former Secretary of State John Kerry meeting with Iranians in Europe and saying, "Don't worry, we're going to get rid of Trump," and you're not saying how, and we'll save your nuclear deal. And Trump has had the courage to get rid of that nuclear deal, and he's right. He's standing up to the mullahs, and they seem to be unstable now. So it's having an effect. I view this midterm election, which is coming up in just 4 weeks, 3.5 weeks, as being very, very critical, because I think that if the Democrats take back one or both of the houses of Congress, it's going to be the end of the progress that's been made
by Trump, even though Trump and his administration are far from everything we'd like them to be. It has had extraordinary successes in terms of reasserting national sovereignty. And philosophically, it has introduced this idea to the American people in a way that I never dreamed it would be introduced. And people are beginning to wake up. So the war against Trump is going to be absolutely fierce. And this is going to be, I think this is their battle of Trier. This is going to be, they're going to try to stem the flow and of Trump's advances, both politically and philosophically. What do you see happening? I mean, how are they operating in terms of trying to get back Congress or hold on to their power?
Well, I'm hoping this is going to be their Waterloo. We shall see. I think they're counting on a lot of vote fraud. I think they're counting on dirty tricks. And Project Veritas has exposed these people bragging about how they steal elections using fraud. So there's no speculation here. We know they use massive amounts of fraud. We know they register dead people and vote for them. They register illegal immigrants and have them vote. They bus people around to multiple polling locations to vote over and over again. We just found out this was going on in Alabama. Trump said millions of people voted illegally in the last election. He's absolutely right. I think that's why the establishment was so confident that Hillary was going to win, because they thought, hey, we've got millions of fraudulent votes. How are they going to beat that? And I think they just weren't prepared for the landslide. So I'm hoping that's what we'll see again in this election. I think you're absolutely right, Chuck. You're right. Trump is not everything we wish he would be. He can't be. If you think of a cruise liner going down the ocean, to try to turn that around on a dime with that kind of momentum, with thousands of people shrieking in your ears and trying to destroy you, that's hard work. So he's got a lot of, issues that he's trying to deal with here at one time. And even parts of the establishment wing of the Republican Party are, secretly behind his back conspiring against him and trying to bring down his agenda. So he's got a tough battle ahead of him. But if Democrats take back control of the House or the Senate, it will become infinitely more difficult. It will be nonstop phony investigations and partisan witch hunts, and nothing will get done. And, that would be an absolute disaster. And you're right, in terms of just the ideas that are coming out, the awareness that's increasing because he's in the presidency. This is unprecedented, Chuck. I'm going to, I speak to Republican clubs. I just spoke to one yesterday in Montana, legislators, high-ranking public officials there. And if I had told them some of this stuff about the deep state, even just, 4 or 5 years ago, they would have, thrown rotten eggs at me and yanked me out of there. But now people are waking up. Now people see it. Now the president is talking about it. And so there's a fundamental shift in the way that a big part of the American electorate understands the world and understands politics. This is unprecedented in my lifetime, and I think for generations going backwards. And if we end up losing this election, that could come to a screeching halt. So we need to do everything we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right. And I think that, you point out the issue of voter fraud. It is a real issue. Even the Secretary of State of California recently admitted that there's been massive registering of illegal aliens, which is unconstitutional. They don't qualify to vote in a national election or for a federal office holder. A good example of how ugly they can be and how this really is a war, and this is real, was the complete attack on Kavanaugh. To me, I hope this is a wake-up call to people, regardless of whether they want to see the Supreme Court, as we do, with at least somewhat more of a constitutional orientation, with judges who actually read the law from the Constitution, as opposed to from some trendy idea. But the attack on him was so ugly, and I think that it's something that we should not let go of, because the whole thing is unraveling. It needs to be investigated further, how this was done, the timing of it, the outright, these ugly charges, which have all been proven to be false at this point, and cooked up, and how this was pulled off. To me, to have a full expose of this, that would really show the extremes, the lengths to which this, I would argue with you, the deep state will go to hold on to their prerogative and their power.
Yep.
Do you have any thoughts about that issue?
I couldn't agree more with you, Chuck. And I think the where this problem really got out of control was in Alabama. There was a special election down there to replace the senator, and so we had Judge Roy Moore, probably one of the most conservative constitutionalist, very, very good public official that we would have had on Capitol Hill. I mean, he just was a rock star in terms of his understanding of the Constitution and the understanding of American history, and being willing to stand for principle. And so they pulled this on him, right? It started with fake news in the Washington Compost. And the problem with Roy Moore was parts of the Republican establishment were so terrified of him coming to Congress and exposing them all for what they are that they joined into it. Oh, there's credibility to these allegations, even though they knew very well that it was a fraud. There's some lawsuits ongoing right now. Now we know there was even voter fraud in that election, too. The Secretary of State in Alabama is investigating massive voter fraud in some of the heavily Democratic counties. They just basically put in enough votes to make sure their guy won. But because we didn't fight back in Alabama, or, I won't say we, I did what I could. I interviewed the judge. I thought he was a wonderful man, and these disgusting allegations of him were so obviously, transparently false. But because the Republican establishment let that happen, then they went for the next target, which, of course, was now Justice Kavanaugh. And, I don't think Justice Kavanaugh is perfect, but what they did to him is absolutely unconscionable. And I think what needs to happen here, I agree with you, Chuck, we cannot just let this slide. We cannot just forget that this happened. We have a video of Nancy Pelosi bragging about, what we do is we make up smear charges, then they get printed in the press, then we point to the press to show that they're true, right? So this is a disgusting, for people who don't comprehend how people could be so evil and so disgusting, you need to pick up a copy of Saul Alinsky's book, Rules for Radicals. When I went to go work for the Leadership Institute, that's the first book they had us read, right? We got to training and boom, have the Saul Alinsky's book. So you open it up, it's dedicated to Lucifer. Literally on the first page, this book is dedicated to Lucifer. And then the next page is, the ends justifies the means. If you have to lie, cheat, steal, whatever it is to grab power, then you do that. And that's what they have done. And in this case, they have violated multiple criminal laws. They have defamed a man. They have filed false reports. I think they've committed perjury. And for us to just say, oh, well, he's confirmed now, so let's just forget all that happened, that would be a big mistake, because they'll do it next time and next time after that. And again, people need to be held accountable for this kind of stuff. And, think of all the girls who really did suffer some kind of sexual abuse, or who really were raped or attacked in some way. Now this shines a bad light on their story. Now they may be afraid to come forward because, everybody has this experience in their mind where these phony allegations came out. So it's bad all around, and we can't let it slide.
Plus, it just ripped apart a very difficult wound in a lot of people, all just to get political advantage. And as far as the nasty behavior, I mean, it reminds me of like when Harry Reid in the 2014 election, 2012 election, he stood up and said Mitt Romney has never filed a tax return. The next day, it was like they had to retract it, but it was damaging. And then afterwards, when he was leaving office, he was asked about this by a reporter. Why would you make such a horrible charge, such a false charge? And his answer was, well, it worked, didn't it?
That's so disgusting. And that's the attitude that they have, Chuck. That is their attitude. They have no moral compass. They think the ends justify the means. And if they have to destroy you and lie and cheat, they will do it. That's what we're dealing with. That's
right. So what we're dealing with here is just at their core, there is no actual system of belief. There's no ethics or morals that can be in any way discerned as objective or as outside of the manipulation of people, which is, of course, a belief in God. But putting that aside, it's essentially comes down to earthly power, anything to obtain power, to maintain power, and to hold on to power to advance some really fuzzy agenda that if you pull away all the cobwebs and you take a look at the inside of the onion, it's the ultimate goal of creating a one world ant colony.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So that's what we're looking at here in this midterm election. Those are the stakes. I mean, I hope people realize that the advances that we've even made in the past 2 years, which are actually fairly substantial in a practical sense in terms of improving the economy and cutting taxes, making taking major chunks out of the nationalization of healthcare, moving America's position in the world into one where we're respected again and not taken for granted. Cutting back on expenses across the board. I mean, these things are going to improve people's lives. I mean, putting aside the fact that sovereignty is a progressive idea, these are practical things that are part of the exercise of sovereignty, and they're going to make life better and already have. And yet, and all of this could be flushed away. We'll be going back to the old days. It's interesting. I keep seeing them say, well, the economy is better because of Obama. I don't know if you saw this.
I have seen that. Obama says that.
He does. And yet, there's a speech that Obama delivered toward the end of his term where he said, we're never going to get these jobs back because they're obsolete. And the country will never, the economy is never going to grow up to 3% more. And all those things have happened. The economy is increased by 4%, and the jobs have come back. And now Obama gives a speech saying, this is because of me. And this is becoming dogma. It's becoming accepted wisdom, especially by younger people who are, I don't want to say that they're ignorant, but maybe it's you've written a book along with the late, great Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld about education, Crimes of the Educators. They're more than ever products of this education where you have this dismembered methodology that by which they can't think in an integrated way. They don't have the ability to cognitively look at things dispassionately and outside of their emotions, perhaps. But either way, that's who's coming up the pike now. Those are the people that are going to vote, and they're the people that are being cultivated. And it is a big concern, at least for me. I mean, what do you make of that? Can we make inroads among the so-called millennials?
Well, I'm incredibly embarrassed to admit I'm actually a millennial. It's horrifying.
How did it happen?
Well, one of the advantages I have is that I was never put through a government school. I never stepped foot in one until university days. And so actually I was blessed with a fantastic education. But, what Dr. Blumenfeld and I exposed in Crimes of the Educators and what Sam had been exposing for 50 years before that is that this is the establishment. This is the deep state's secret weapon, right? They have iron grip over the so-called public school system. And we need to recognize that this is no longer an education system. This has become, as Sam would say, a tool for dumbing down the population of the United States. And beyond that, dumbing down and indoctrinating. And what they've done here, and this was kind of Sam's raison d'etre with his whole life. What they've done is they've now nationwide, under Common Core, this is mandated. They use methods of teaching and reading that we've known since the 1840s are absolute quackery. They produce illiteracy on a massive scale. That's why we have, according to the federal government's own numbers, about half of Americans can't even read or are so close to being illiterate that we might as well call them that. And that's deliberate, right? So these people who have been so indoctrinated with this junk in public school, so indoctrinated with this junk on the communist news network and the fake news, the Washington Comp, all these fake news organizations, they don't even have the means to go out and educate themselves. They can't go down to the library and pick up a book because they can't read it. So we are in a very dangerous situation. And I tell people this all the time. I don't care what your pet issue is, whether it's, guns or stopping abortion or lowering taxes or, pick your conservative or liberty issue. Doesn't matter what it is. If we don't get a handle on the education, and this is what Sam would say all the time, if we don't get control over the education problem, all of it is a moot point over the long run, right? Because they've got something like 87% of our kids in the government schools. Even if we, generously assume that not all of those, say, less than 80% of them will come out of there totally indoctrinated. We're dealing with a massive problem because these kids are going to be the future voters. These kids are going to be the future politicians. These kids are supposed to run these companies. And where are we going to be? As the older generations die off, as the people who knew history and who knew the truth start dying off, and all we're left with is kids who've only been told that America is evil and slavery and bad thing. But my friend and colleague Dr. Duke Pesta does surveys of his students at the University of Wisconsin when they come into his class, and he said more than half of them believe that America invented slavery. So it's no wonder they want to tear down our country. And if we don't get a handle on this, we're going to lose it all. So I tell people, education is the key.
Absolutely. Alex, we're reaching toward the end of the program. So is there anything else you'd like to bring up?
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for having me on the program, Chuck. It's been great to be with you. I think I've talked to you a few times recently from Europe. I'll be heading back to Europe in just a few days, so hopefully we'll get a chance to talk more. I know the internet's been really spotty there, especially down in the Balkans, the former Yugoslavia. The internet's not all that great, but hopefully I'll get to talk to you again soon. I'll keep you updated on what's going on over there. And thanks again for having me on. I hope people will check out thenewamerican.com. If you don't subscribe to the print magazine, do that. That's where you'll get all this important information that you need about what's going on. And thanks again, Chuck. Really appreciate you having me on.
All right, Alex. And I'd like to get an update from Europe if we can arrange it.
Absolutely.
And we can talk about European politics as it stands right now. Anyways, Alex, thanks so much. And I'll talk to you soon.
Hey, thank you so much, Chuck.
All right.